November 9, 1989.
A Thursday night. In America, most families were sitting down to dinner. The evening news was about to air. And then, something happened that nobody expected. Something that would make millions of Americans stop eating, stop talking, and stare at their television screens in disbelief. A reporter in Germany was saying that the impossible had happened. The Berlin Wall. That concrete monster that had divided a city, a country, and the entire world for 28 years, was open. People were crossing. East Germans were walking into West Berlin. Guards were standing aside. And the world was watching. For Americans who had grown up with the Cold War, who had practiced duck and cover drills in elementary school, who had watched the Cuban Missile Crisis unfold on black and white TVs, who had sons and brothers fighting in Vietnam to stop communism, this moment was something they never thought they would see. The wall was not just concrete and barbed wire. It was the physical embodiment of everything America had fought against for decades. It was the symbol of oppression. The Iron Curtain made visible. A scar across the face of Europe. And now, it was falling. But here is the strange thing. The official reaction from Washington was not celebration. Not victory laps. Not dancing in the streets. President George H.W. Bush sat in the Oval Office and made a deliberate decision. He would not dance on the wall. He would not gloat. He would not declare victory. And that decision, as much as anything that happened in Berlin that night, would shape the next 30 years of world history. This is the story of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Through American eyes. Part 1, The Wall That Divided the World, 2:30 to 6 o'clock. To understand what November 9, 1989 meant to Americans, you have to understand what the Berlin Wall meant to them. August 13, 1961. Americans woke up to shocking news. The communists had built a wall through the middle of Berlin. Overnight. Families were separated. Workers could not go to their jobs. Grandparents could not see their grandchildren. For Americans, this was confirmation of everything they believed about the Soviet Union. This was not a political disagreement. This was evil. Plain and simple. Building a wall to keep your own people imprisoned? What kind of system does that? President John F. Kennedy stood before the world and said something that every American child would learn, Ich bin ein Berliner. I am a Berliner. It was a promise. America would not abandon West Berlin. America would not abandon freedom. Over the next 28 years, the wall became the central image of the Cold War. Every American who visited West Berlin went to see it. They stood on the western side and looked at the graffiti, the art, the expressions of freedom. And then they looked at the eastern side. Bare concrete. Guard towers. Machine guns. No one could cross. Hundreds died trying. Shot by border guards. Drowned in rivers. Electrocuted on fences. Their crime. They wanted to be free. American presidents from Kennedy to Reagan stood at that wall and spoke about freedom. Reagan's famous words in 1987, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The crowd cheered. But privately, even Reagan's advisors thought the line was too aggressive. Too provocative. No one really believed the wall would fall anytime soon. But it did. And when it happened, Americans watched with tears in their eyes. Part 2, The Night It Happened, American Eyes on Germany, 6 to 10 o'clock. November 9, 1989 started as an ordinary Thursday. In Washington, President Bush was preparing for a state dinner. In New York, people were heading home from work. In Chicago, families were sitting down for dinner. Then, at 6:53 p.m. Eastern Time, something happened. A confused East German official named Günter Schabowski held a press conference in East Berlin. He was reading from a note about new travel regulations. But he was confused. He hadn't been properly briefed. When a reporter asked when the new rules would take effect, Schabowski shuffled his papers and said, "As far as I know, immediately." He was wrong. The rules were supposed to take effect the next day. But his words went out over live television. And within minutes, thousands of East Germans were walking toward the wall. The guards at the checkpoints had no orders. No one knew what to do. They tried to hold the crowds back. But the crowds kept coming. Thousands. Then tens of thousands. At 10:45 p.m. Berlin time, the commander at the Bornholmer Strasse crossing gave up. He opened the gates. East Germans flooded through. In America, it was late afternoon on the West Coast, early evening on the East Coast. NBC News was the only American network with live coverage. Tom Brokaw was on air. And what viewers saw was unlike anything in television history. People crying. Strangers hugging. East Germans walking through the gates with dazed expressions, unable to believe they were actually in West Berlin. West Germans reaching out to pull them through. Champagne flowing. Total strangers kissing. Americans watching at home did not understand German. But they understood tears. They understood joy. They understood freedom. One image captivated America more than any other. The Mauerspekt. Woodpeckers. Germans with hammers and chisels, climbing onto the wall and chipping away pieces of it. They were not destroying property. They were destroying a prison. And Americans watching saw themselves in those images. If America had a wall, they thought, Americans would be the first ones with sledgehammers. Part 3, The President Who Wouldn't Dance, 10 to 14:30. While Americans celebrated, one man in Washington made a decision that would confuse the media but shape history. President George H.W. Bush was informed of the wall opening during a state dinner. His reaction? Quiet. Calm. Measured. The next morning, he held a press conference. Reporters expected triumph. They expected Reagan-style rhetoric. Instead, they got this. "I'm not going to dance on the wall." The media criticized him. Their headlines the next day were not kind. Bush reacts cautiously to historic event. President lacks vision. Where's the emotion? But Bush had reasons that reporters did not understand. First, he remembered history. After World War I, the victorious Allies had humiliated Germany. They had imposed harsh terms. They had danced on the grave of the German Empire. And what did that lead to? 20 years later, World War II. Bush was determined not to repeat that mistake. A humiliated Germany, he believed, was a dangerous Germany. A Germany that was welcomed into the family of nations, that was treated with dignity, that was helped through a difficult transition, that Germany could be an ally for generations. Second, he was thinking about the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev was still in power. The Soviet military was still in East Germany. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were stationed there. If the United States started gloating, started waving flags and declaring victory, what would Gorbachev do? His hardliners were already angry. They were already looking for excuses to crack down. Bush did not want to give them that excuse. Third, he was thinking about German unity. The wall had fallen, but Germany was still divided. Two countries. Two economies. Two militaries. If the United States pushed too hard for rapid unification, it could destabilize all of Europe. The French were nervous. The British were nervous. The Soviets were terrified. Someone had to be calm. Someone had to be steady. Bush decided that someone would be him. Years later, historians would praise this decision. But at the time, it took real courage. Courage to resist the easy applause. Courage to do what was right instead of what was popular. Part 4, Checkpoint Charlie, American Soldiers Watch History, 1430 to 1730. At Checkpoint Charlie, the most famous crossing point between East and West Berlin, American soldiers stood in their guard booths and watched. They had been stationed there for years. Day after day, they had watched East German guards stare back at them through binoculars. They had watched refugees make desperate attempts to escape. They had watched bodies pulled from the death strip. Now, they watched something else. East Germans walking through. Not running. Not dodging bullets. Just walking. Families with children. Old people with suitcases. Young people with tears streaming down their faces. The American soldiers had orders. Strict orders. Do not provoke. Do not engage. Do not celebrate. Stand guard. Maintain professionalism. But they were human. And when the first East Germans reached the American side, some of those soldiers had tears in their eyes too. One soldier later told a reporter, "I'd been here for 18 months. I'd seen what that wall did to people. Families separated. Lovers torn apart. People shot for trying to leave. And now, suddenly, it was over. Just like that. I couldn't believe it. None of us could." Another soldier said, "We shook hands with some of the East Germans who came through. They kept thanking us. Thanking America. Thanking the flag. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there and shook hands and tried not to cry." Those soldiers were not politicians. They were not diplomats. They were just kids from Ohio and Texas and California who had been sent to guard a checkpoint in a divided city. And they ended up witnessing one of the great moments of the 20th century. The fall of the wall was joyful. But it was also dangerous. The Soviet Union still had 380,000 troops stationed in East Germany. Thousands of tanks. Thousands of nuclear weapons. If those troops had been ordered to move, the world would have faced a catastrophe. President Bush understood this. And he understood something else. Mikhail Gorbachev was different from previous Soviet leaders. He was not Stalin. He was not Brezhnev. He was a reformer. He had let the wall fall without firing a shot. He had not ordered his troops to crush the protests. Bush made a decision. He would support Gorbachev. He would not humiliate him. He would not push him aside. He would work with him. This was not popular with everyone in Washington. There were people who wanted to declare victory. There were people who wanted to push for immediate German reunification. There were people who wanted to expand NATO all the way to the Soviet border immediately. Bush said no. Not yet. Not so fast. He sent quiet messages to Moscow. "We are not your enemy. We want a peaceful transition. We want Germany to be unified, but we want it to happen in a way that does not threaten you." Gorbachev received those messages. And he made his own decision. He would not send troops. He would not crush the uprising. He would let history take its course. Years later, when asked why the Cold War ended peacefully, historians point to many factors. The courage of the German people. The weakness of the Soviet economy. The reforms of Gorbachev. But also, the quiet, steady leadership of George H.W. Bush. The president who would not dance on the wall. Back in America, the reaction was pure joy. Newspapers ran banner headlines: "Wall falls. Freedom. End of an era." Television news showed the same images over and over. Germans dancing on the wall. People crying. Soldiers standing aside. The images were so powerful that even people who had never cared about foreign policy found themselves glued to their screens. In schools across America, teachers stopped their lessons and turned on the television. Children who had been born after the wall was built watched history happen. Their parents explained what it meant. The Cold War. The threat of nuclear war. The fear that had hung over their entire childhoods. It was ending. Right now. On live television. In churches, people prayed. In bars, people cheered. In living rooms, people cried.
One woman in Iowa told a reporter, "I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was in college. We thought the world was going to end. We really did. And now, all these years later, it's over. It's actually over. I never thought I'd live to see it." A veteran who had fought in Vietnam said, "I lost friends over there. We were told we were fighting communism. I never really understood what that meant until I saw those people walking through that wall. Now I get it. That's what we were fighting for. So people could be free." The change in American public opinion was astonishing. In October 1989, just weeks before the wall fell, most Americans still viewed the Soviet Union as a mortal enemy. By December, polls showed that 65% of Americans believed the US and USSR would be allies by the year 2000. 65%. That was not just a shift. That was a transformation. The entire Cold War worldview, built over for decades, crumbled as fast as the wall itself. In the weeks and months that followed, Americans began to understand what had happened. The wall had not just fallen. The entire system it represented was collapsing. One by one, the communist governments of Eastern Europe fell. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. All gone. All replaced by democracies. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist. The red flag would come down over the Kremlin for the last time. The Cold War, which had dominated American life for half a century, was over. For Americans, this created a strange new feeling. For their entire lives, they had defined themselves in opposition to the Soviet Union. We are not them. We are free, they are oppressed. We are democratic, they are totalitarian. We are good, they are evil. Now, suddenly, their them was gone. What did it mean to be American without an enemy? Some Americans celebrated their end of history, they called it. Democracy had won. Freedom had won. America had won. There was nothing left to fight for. Others were more cautious. They warned that new enemies would emerge. That the world was still dangerous. That peace was fragile. Both were right, in different ways. The 1990s would be a decade of American dominance. No rival superpower. No existential threat. Just peace and prosperity. The dot-com boom. The longest economic expansion in American history. But the 2000s would bring new challenges. New enemies. New wars. New fears. Still, for one brief moment, in November 1989, Americans allowed themselves to feel something they had not felt in generations. Hope. Pure, uncomplicated hope. The kind of hope that comes when something you thought would last forever suddenly, miraculously, ends. 30 years later, Americans look back at the fall of the Berlin Wall with complicated feelings. On one hand, it remains one of the great moments in American memory. The images are still powerful. The joy is still real. The sense of victory is still present. On the other hand, Americans know that the story did not end there. The reunification of Germany was harder than anyone expected. The economic gap between East and West persisted for decades. The psychological gap lasted even longer. And the world that emerged after the Cold War was not the peaceful, orderly world that many had imagined. New conflicts arose. New divisions emerged. Some of them, disturbingly, looked a lot like old divisions. In recent years, walls have made a comeback. Not in Europe, but elsewhere. The US-Mexico border. The Israeli West Bank barrier. Walls in Hungary, in Bulgaria, in places that once celebrated the fall of the Berlin Wall. This has forced Americans to ask difficult questions. What does it mean to celebrate the fall of a wall while building new ones? What does it mean to champion freedom abroad while debating freedom at home? What does it mean to remember the joy of 1989 while living in the complexities of today? These questions have no easy answers. But they are worth asking. Because the fall of the Berlin Wall was not just a German story. It was not just a European story. It was an American story. A human story. A story about what happens when people decide they will not be imprisoned anymore. And that story is never really over. November 9, 1989. A Thursday night. A confused press conference. A wrong answer to a reporter's question. And the world changed forever. For Americans who lived through it, the memory is still sharp. Where they were. What they felt. Who they hugged when they heard the news. For Americans born after, it is history. A chapter in a textbook. A black and white photograph. A story their parents tell. But the lesson of that night is not just for those who were there. It is for all of us. Walls do not last. Oppression does not last. Fear does not last. Eventually, people decide they have had enough. And when they do, all the concrete in the world cannot stop them. The Mauerspect with their hammers and chisels understood this. They chipped away at that wall, piece by piece, until it was gone. They did not wait for permission. They did not wait for the right moment. They just started swinging. That is the American spirit. That is the human spirit. That is what the fall of the Berlin Wall means, then and now. Freedom is not given. It is taken. And once it is taken, it cannot be taken back. The wall fell. The world changed. And we are still living in the world that night created. What will we do with it?